The U.S. national debt is increasing by $2 million per minute, and the overall national debt has reached an unbelievable level of $35 trillion.
The federal debt load snowballing in recent months, adding about $1 trillion every 100 days and currently sitting near $34.5 trillion in total.
It has now surpassed $35 trillion.
Are we in a debt crisis or are we headed for one? We are at the beginning of a very classic late big cycle debt crisis.
The rising national debt that can reach $141 trillion, that's with a T, by 2054, according to the latest CBD report.
The population of the United States is 335 million, which means every single U.S. citizen has a debt of $104,000. Out of these 335 million, 130 million people are taxpayers. If only taxpayers had to pay it, then each taxpayer has to pay more than $250,000 to finish off this debt. But being one of the strongest countries in the world, how did the US reach such a high level of debt? In this video, I will explain everything about the US debt crisis. Make sure you watch the video till the end. By the end of the video, you will know more about the US debt crisis than anyone else. Every government in the world has income and expenses. The government's primary source of income is the direct income tax it collects from citizens and the indirect tax it collects from every monetary transaction that happens in the country. When the government spends more than it earns, it borrows money. So the national debt of the US is the amount the government has borrowed to fund its expenses. In simple language, the national debt is similar to a person using a credit card for purchases. Let's imagine you have a credit card and you only pay the minimum balance of your credit card bill each month. Then, after some time, you will accumulate a lot of credit card debt. You have to either pay the debt to avoid it increasing more, or you will have to increase the payment amount each month. If you cannot pay the debt, then you might get another credit card to pay off the debt of your previous credit card. This way, you've borrowed even more money now. Similar is the case with the US government. The US government has not accumulated this debt in just the last few years. When the US was founded in 1776, it had no debt. But by the end of the Revolutionary War for its independence, from 1775 to 1783, it had accrued $77 million in debt in the year 1783. After this, by the year 1835, the US debt had become zero. But soon it increased to more than $2 billion by the end of the Civil War in 1865. After World War I, the US debt was $22 billion. Before World War II in 1940, the US debt was $51 billion. But by the end of World War II in 1946, it had increased to $260 billion. After that, this debt grew with inflation, and by 1990, it had reached $1 trillion. From 1990 to 2008, this debt increased 10 times to $10 trillion. And in the last 15 years since 2008, the debt has increased from $10 trillion to a massive amount of $35 trillion. Now, you must have a few questions in mind, such as, how is the government planning to pay off this debt? Is it even possible for the US to pay off this debt? Who gave money to the US government when it was already trillions of dollars in debt? Who exactly will the US government pay it back? The answer to all these questions lies in how this debt was created. The US government creates this debt through the issuance of government securities. This is basically a loan given to the government by investors. These investors can be anyone, such as individuals, financial institutes, mutual funds, pension funds, the Federal Reserve, foreign governments, etc. So here is how this process works. The US Treasury creates treasury bills, and investors buy those treasury bills. Now, you might be thinking, why would investors buy these treasury bills? Because there are many benefits for investors in buying those bills. The first benefit is safety. US Treasury bills are considered one of the safest investments because they are backed by the full faith and credit of the US government. The second benefit is predictable returns. Investors receive regular interest payments and the return of principal at maturity, making these treasury bills a reliable source of income. The third benefit is liquidity. these Treasury secretaries are highly liquid and can be easily bought and sold in the secondary market. The demand for these bills in the secondary market is high, so the investors can sell their Treasury bills to whoever is willing to buy them. Then, the government uses this money collected from the Treasury bills for its expenses. Recent data shows that around 68% of the total $35 trillion is owed to domestic investors and 32% to foreign investors. Out of these 68% domestic investors, 27% are government agencies, such as 13% to the Social Security Trust Fund and other retirement funds, around 14% of the Federal Reserve. The remaining 41% of domestic holders are private investors and institutions such as mutual funds, pension funds, insurance companies, and individuals. The foreign holders are foreign governments and institutions. Out of 32% of foreign holders, the Japanese government and institutions have the biggest holding at 5%. The Chinese have 4%, the UK and Ireland each have 2%, Luxembourg has 1%, and the remaining 18% is owned by other countries in the world. So, out of $35 trillion, the US government owes $24 trillion to domestic investors and $11 trillion to foreign investors. Now, in the last 15 years, since 2008, there's been a rise of $25 trillion in national debt. So, is there a limit to these borrowings by the government? And how much is the government allowed to borrow? The government cannot indefinitely keep issuing these treasury bills and keep borrowing money. There has to be a limit to this borrowing, right? Actually, there is a limit to this borrowing by the government, and this limit is known as the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling has a cap set by Congress and is the amount of money that the federal government is allowed to borrow to meet its existing legal obligations. When the government hits its borrowing limit, it has to get permission of Congress to increase the borrowing limit.
Here's the deal. There's a cap on what we can borrow called the debt limit, and only Congress can raise or lower that debt limit. So let me be really clear. This is really important to know. Raising the debt limit is about paying off our old debts. There's nothing to do with any new spending being considered.
The Congress has been raising the debt ceiling since the 1980s. After 2001, the debt ceiling was increased almost every single year. After the 2008 crisis, the debt ceiling was also suspended for many years. From the year 2013 to July 2021, the debt ceiling was suspended. When the debt ceiling is suspended, it means that the limit on the amount of money the federal government is allowed to borrow is removed. During the suspension period, the Treasury Department is permitted to issue new debt without any specific limit, which effectively allows it to meet all of the government's financial obligations without the constraint of the debt ceiling. That's why you see a rise of $25 trillion in the last 15 years after the 2008 crisis. So basically, Congress raised the debt ceiling every single time and also suspended it for almost 10 years. So in reality, this debt ceiling has no ceiling. If the government does not raise the debt ceiling, then the US government might default on its own obligations to its investors. But how long can this go on? The debt has already reached $35 trillion. If the government keeps borrowing at this rate, then by 2028, this debt will reach $46 trillion. So, is there a way the government is planning to reduce this debt? Or will this go on forever? In the year 2023, the income of the US government was $4.4 trillion. Out of this $4.4 trillion, $658 billion were spent on the interest payment of the national debt. So, around 15% of the money goes back to paying off the debt. But if the government keeps borrowing, then it is difficult to reduce this debt. What happens if the government doesn't address the debt crisis? If the US doesn't take steps to address the debt crisis, the consequences could be severe, such as default. If the government can't pay its bills, it could default on its debt. This would cause a financial crisis both in the US and globally, as investors lose confidence in the US government's ability to manage its finances. If the government decides to print more money to pay off the debt, then it will lead to hyperinflation. where prices skyrocket and the value of money plummets. This can lead to economic chaos and widespread hardship. We've recently seen this in Venezuela. One of the biggest obstacles a government faces is the rising interest rate. If interest rates rise, then it affects everything. As interest rates rise, the cost of servicing the national debt increases. This is because the US government must pay higher interest on newly issued debt and on any existing debt that is rolled over at higher rates. Higher interest payments consume a larger portion of the federal budget, leaving less available for other government spending priorities such as infrastructure, education, and defense. It is estimated that by 2029, the US will be paying $1 trillion in just interest payments to service its debt. The biggest advantage the US has is that its debt is in US dollars. This means that the US government can always print more money to meet its debt obligations, reducing the likelihood of default. This is a significant advantage for the US. If there was any other country instead of the US, that country would probably have been bankrupt by now. The US dollar is a global currency, and countries hold the US dollar as their foreign reserve. Also, the US dollar is known as the petrodollar, where all the crude oil trades around the world are done in US dollar. The US had done deals with oil countries like Saudi Arabia that these oil countries would sell their crude oil in dollars only, which strengthened the US dollar as all countries in the world needed dollars to buy crude oil, which is an important commodity for any country. But recently, Saudi Arabia has ended this petrodollar deal, and now they will sell their crude oil in different currencies. This is bad news for the US. The US can withstand this national debt as long as the dollar is strong and perceived by the other countries as a strong currency. If the dollar becomes weak, then it can affect investors' confidence. If investors perceive that the US is unable to maintain the value of its currency, they might demand higher interest rates to buy US Treasury bills or reduce their holdings, which could increase borrowing costs for the US, ultimately increasing the national debt. If the dollar becomes weak, this will be a huge problem for the US to pay back its national debt. So overall, the US national debt is concerning. It doesn't look like the US government will be able to control it in the near future, but you, as an individual, can control and protect financial future by making the right investments. We recommend that you subscribe to our newsletter on our website to learn more about value investing. If you like this video, then give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more such content.